At T-Mobile, our critical mission is providing unparalleled 5G coverage for when connectivity is mission critical. Introducing T-Priority, America's best 5G network experience for first responders, even in times of congestion. More capacity, faster speeds, better coverage. T-Priority from T-Mobile, built for tomorrow's emergencies, ready today. Discover more at t-priority.com.
For qualifying organizations on eligible rate plans, coverage not available in some areas and may be impacted by emergencies.
Achtung Millwall podcast supports the Lions Food Hub, dear listeners, and you can do too by getting yourself an Achtung Millwall t-shirt from noonelikes.co.uk, also known as Nolu Clothing. They've got a wonderful Achtung Millwall t-shirt on there for £15. At least £8 of each sale goes to support the Lions Food Hub, which does fantastic work for families in and around the South East 16 area. Show your allegiances on the podcast front, dear listeners, by getting yourself an Achtung Millwall t-shirt, and by doing that, you'll support the wonderful, the brilliant Lions Food Hub. Noonelikes.co.uk, Achtung Millwall t-shirt, £15. Check it out.
You're listening to Achtung Millwall, broadcasting from the beautiful South Birmingham. Accept no substitute.
Hello, dear listeners. Welcome to Achtung Millwall. My name is Nick Hart, and you find me in reflective mood tonight, dear listeners, thinking ahead to Saturday's FA Cup tie versus Crystal Palace. Reflective? Well, I'm thinking about football rivalries. Is Crystal Palace a football rivalry, as described by Alex Neil in the Southwark News this week? He speaks of his desire for us to attack the fifth round tie. Goes on to say the players are well aware of the rivalry between us. And I suppose there is a rivalry. Certainly, it's they're near neighbours, aren't they? And I was just thinking as to what kind of constitutes a rivalry. The great ones in football, obviously, the classics are the Boca Juniors versus River Plate, the Celtic versus Rangers, Liverpool versus Everton, even our own conflab with West Ham. These are the great rivalries of football. But I was thinking about my own personal feelings towards Crystal Palace. What drives your choice of rival? And I'm a boy brought up in the 1970s, dear listeners. I went from Mottingham, as I've said a few times on these shows, brought up in Mottingham in the 60s. And secondary school for me was Cooper's in Chislehurst, which was, in contrast to most of the kids in my class from Castlecombe School, Mottingham, most of them went to a place called Kemnall Manor School, which is nearer to Mottingham, kind of the Chislehurst side of Mottingham, if you like. One or two of us, the select band of brothers, went from Mottingham to Cooper's, which was a rather different experience. Back then, class, dare I speak such a term to you, class drove education in a way that, whether it still does or not, I don't know. It shouldn't do, but maybe it still does. Certainly it did back in the 70s, and Kemnall Manor was very much seen as the council estate kids' school from ourselves in Mottingham. Also the similar kinds of areas, Cold Harbour Estate, I presume, as it was over on that side of the A208. But certainly it had a reputation for being the council estate secondary school. Cooper's, when I went there, was still deemed to be a grammar school. I think it lost that status very shortly after I arrived. I didn't have any impact on that, listeners. That was just, educational policy of the early 1970s. But I went there in the early 72. And suffice to say, having gone from our warm-hearted little, probably underachieving council estate primary school called Castlecombe, which actually tried in its way to extend our horizons and did a good job in truth. But certainly when we all pitched up at Cooper's, it felt very different. And one of the footballing aspects of that difference, quite apart from many other things, was it was seen to be stuffed full of Crystal Palace fans. And I started going to watch Millwall from 72, so I'd have been 11, going towards 12. So my first year in secondary school would have been 1972 September. So gradually, with my burgeoning football consciousness, I became well aware there were very few Millwall fans going to Cooper's School. And loads and loads and loads, it seemed to me, Crystal Palace fans, middle-class kids for the most part, from places like Bickley, Bromley, Orpington, Petswood, and so on. As later life has taken me to those kinds of places, I'm well aware now that not everywhere in Orpington, nor Bromley, nor Beckenham, for that matter, is always leafy middle-class high income. But certainly at that point in my life, I didn't have that range of experience. So it seemed to me that, I was amongst an alien tribe. And I think I've always been affected, I suppose, by that experience, as we all are. Our experience in our teenage years drives the rest of our lives. So for me, I've always associated, wrongly in fairness, having lived in Croydon at a later point in my life, but I've always associated Crystal Palace as a kind of middle class, almost like a high-end estate agents kind of club, which is an unfair depiction of them, but I can't shake it to this day, dear listeners. And we find ourselves facing them in the FA Cup this coming Saturday. Reading through some of the accounts on the news at Den, VAR is going to rear its ugly head for the first time in a Millwall match. Merv and I touched on that yesterday in our conversation. Michael Oliver, the Premier League referee for the most part, is going to referee us with 7 red cards to his credit, if that's such a way to put it. Lions have actually got through the season with only just 1 red card, so whether we'll get some more out of Michael Oliver on Saturday, we'll find out. But yeah, it's the era of the brink of the Premier League. If we ever do make it, it's going to feel a bit like this, dear listeners. Playing Crystal Palace with VAR and celebrity referees, all the things that you tend to hate in modern football. So as I say, I am cursed, whether I like it or not, with a fundamental view of Crystal Palace as being very, very different to my own dear, beloved Millwall. I don't think of Charlton in that way. I think Charlton feels more like a familial row over Christmas dinner or something with too much drinking. They are not so different from us. They might think of themselves as such, but they aren't. Crystal Palace has always irrationally felt very, very different in class terms to Millwall. I'm sure I'll get a few comments online for these thoughts, but there we are. You got to say it like you see it. So yeah, Alex Neil wants us to attack this game, which I approve of. I think we're up against it, dear listeners. I think Palace are, a moderate to lower level Premier League side, but they should be more than capable of taking a game to us. Obviously now with the acquisition of our dual, Romain Esse, whose transfer has helped fund some of the recent attractive players that we've acquired, but they should have enough in their armoury to overcome us as a mid-table, upwardly mobile, shall I say, championship club. But the form should go their way, especially at Selhurst Park. Alex Neil, speaking to News at Den, says he sees it as an important game because it is a local rivalry, and I like this quote. It's an important game because it's an important game to our fans, which means it's an important game to me. I like that logic. He's saying because it's important to those on the terraces, it's important to him. He obviously comes from Scotland. I mean, you can tell that from just a few seconds of listening to him. But he would have been brought up in the realms of the Celtic v Rangers, thing up there. So yeah, and all footballers, I think, understand the desire and the power of the local derby, and he clearly gets it. He says it's a cracking game for us because it's a one-off hit. We can go out there and attack it. There are no league points at stake. He wants his team to play with emotion, but controlled emotion. And then goes on to refer to the fact we've got a few enforced changes. Kramer and Connolly, I think, Angelo corrected me on YouTube. I think I said Cundall might be cup-tied in the previous edition, but I think it's Connolly. I've been corrected on YouTube comments. So a big thank you to Angelo. But yeah, we're going to be playing obviously without Kramer and Wes Harding coming back in the right back position. I wonder whether we'll see Jensen in goal or whether we'll see Liam Roberts. I don't know. So yeah, interesting thoughts And an interesting question to pose to you, dear listeners. I mean, obviously the classic rivalry, if you use that Americanised term, the classic local derby for us is West Ham. And I've kind of learned that over my Mill career. We really haven't rarely ever played them in truth. So although I understand the rivalry, I wasn't brought up soaked in it, if you like. Obviously the Harry Cripps testimonial was prior to my time. There was the very sad incident of someone being killed at New Cross in clashes between the two sets of fans in the mid 70s. Sorry. So I understand the backdrop to the hostility, but I've never felt myself soaked in it in a way that going to school, being around kids from different backgrounds to you, and the fact we played Crystal Palace far more often, including one of the fixtures I'm going to touch on in this show, just meant that I always felt that rivalry more keenly than the West Ham one. To some extent, I think it remains so to this day. I know we're all meant to hate West Ham fans. Every time I've ever dealt with them work-wise or, any other-wise, really, they're very similar. And I can't really truly bring myself to, to fuel the fire on that front. But anyway, that's the backdrop of the Crystal Palace game for me. Do tell me in your comments or in reply how you see them. I did see one great description online of them as being just kind of irritants, and I think there probably is a healthy slice of irritation with Crystal Palace. But when I started going in the early 70s, Crystal Palace fell under this kind of false glamour, whereas Chelsea had a certain King's Road, Peter Osgood, Charlie Cook, Alan Hudson FA Cup winning pizzazz about them. Crystal Palace aspired to that without ever truly achieving it. And I think there was probably a sense that there was a trying hard kind of quality to the team back then, which again, through this team of the 70s stuff, team of the 80s, they've flogged it the whole Malcolm Allison era, which is where I'm going to be talking about today. I think I always probably found them as an irritant, probably more than anything else than what you might call a true rivalry. So there we are, dear listeners. That's my take on Saturday's game. I'm going to go. I haven't been to Selhurst Park for a long time, actually. Going to be an interesting trip over there. We've actually played Crystal Palace in the FA Cup quite a lot. And I was surprised when I checked this out on 11versus11.com. Since 1921, which is when the website starts, so it'd also match our Football League career. We've actually played Crystal Palace 11 times in FA Cup football. And we've got 1922 here, a 2-0 win in the second replay after a 0-0 draw for Millwall over Crystal Palace. A goal-scoring loss after another replay in 1929. 5-3 to Crystal Palace on that occasion. A 4-1 win for the Lions in 1950 at Selhurst. 57, we beat Crystal Palace 2-0. 75, which is the game I'm going to talk about now, I had an initial 1-1 draw at the Den. That's going to be a game I'm going to come back to in a moment, dear listeners. We then lose the replay 2-1 a few days later, December 1975. And then in the 85, I'd forgotten this game. We won 2-1 at Crystal Palace after a 1-1 draw at the Coldblow Lane, that would have been, wouldn't it? And then obviously a couple of years ago at Zampa Road, as it was then, 8th of Jan 2022, a 2-1 loss at home to Crystal Palace now as a Premier League side. We've actually got a pretty decent record. Let's count up the wins. So 1, 2, 3, 4 wins for Millwall in FA Cup football, and so 1, 2, 3 wins for Crystal Palace. If you want to throw in the Anglo-Italian Cup, which is a very strange, not quite a pre-season, but it had pre-season kind of a feeling about it. They won that one 3-0 in 1993, 14th of September. For Crystal Palace 3, Millwall 0 in the Anglo-Italian Cup. I might do another show another time about the Anglo-Italian Cup, which was kind of a weird thing in a way when you think back to it. We never actually got to Italy in that, dear listeners. It was always played in England at our stage, so there we are. But I want to choose a game I was actually at, and I've picked out that selection of old FA Cup ties that I've just chosen. The first game in 1975, the 13th of December 1975, Millwall won Crystal Palace 1.
At your job, do you ever have to deal with a nose roller? How about a snub pulley? Well, if you're installing a new conveyor belt system, dealing with the different components can sound like you're speaking a foreign language. Luckily, you've got a team ready to help. Grainger's technical product specialists are fluent in maintenance, repair, and operations. So whenever you want to talk shop, just reach out. Call, click Grainger.com, or just stop by. Grainger, for the ones who get it done.
At the Den. And as I say, I've chosen that really based on the fact that I was there and I can remember the late equaliser for the Lions scored by Phil Summerall. So I've picked out two match reports. Let's read you the Mill team and Palace team, actually. I've got both here. This is a report in the Sunday Express. So it finished Millwall 1, Crystal Palace 1. This is a report by John Pike of the Sunday Express. Mill's team: Ray Goddard, Ray Evans, John Moore, Tony Hazel, Barry Kitchener, Terry Brisley, Alan Welsh, Alan Hart, Phil Summerall, Frank Saul and Barry Salvage. On the substitute bench, Dave Donaldson. The Palace team, I think it was Paul Hammond, Wall, I don't know, and Jim Cannon, Johnson, I can't remember his first name, Jump, Ray Evans, Ian Evans, sorry, he would come back and coach at the Den later on. Nicky Chatterton, I picked him out as one of our players. Again, did really well for us when he transferred across from Crystal Palace. Martin Hinshelwood, I think it was Dave Kemp, Dave Swindlehurst, Peter Taylor was their great talent, who played for England actually later on in the 70s. Substitute was Alan Whittle, where I remember getting slaughtered for his blonde, pasty looks at the Den when he came there. So yeah, the game. This would be the second round FA Cup game, played on the 13th of December 1975. Very different world. I would have been 15 at this point. Yeah, just 15. The report: Phil Foyle's Palace, says John Pike. A dramatic goal in the 3rd minute of injury time by Phil Summerall gave Millwall a deserved draw with Crystal Palace, with a trip to Scarborough in the 3rd round as the reward for the winners of the replay. We wouldn't get that trip to Scarborough, dear listeners. Spoiler alert. I like this description. As a skillful football encounter, this match was a disaster. But if you like full-blooded entertainment in a cup tie, then this was it. There was an early goal, a missed penalty, a fan who dropped his trousers on the pitch. I missed that. I don't remember that. And as Pike here says, that was the action of a brave man on a freezing cold day, and the last-ditch goal, which he's already mentioned. But nothing quite came off. Not even the mini crowd invasion just before Millwall equalised failed, and that just about summed up the afternoon. I'd forgotten the mini crowd invasion. There's quite a few back in the 70s, to be fair. Palace had taken the lead in the 11th minute when Peter Taylor was rather lucky to get away with a free kick. Martin Hinshelwood dummied to take the kick. Peter Taylor drove it in onto the head of Jim Cannon, who nodded it into an unmarked David Swindlehurst to easily head past Ray Goddard in the Mill goal. From then on to half-time, play took on the look of a stampede as both sides chased everything. Swindlehurst hit the Millwall bar and 2 other Palace goals were disallowed for fouls on a goalkeeper. Barry Kitchener ended up in the referee's book for a foul on Jeffrey Johnson. In the 50th minute, Millwall were rewarded a penalty when Evans brought down Alan Hart. Ian Evans brought down Alan Hart. Namesake, no relation, incidentally, listeners. Barry Salvage hammered his spot kick well wide, and not surprisingly, the crowds hesitated before giving the ball back. Very witty, like that. But Millwall put it together better in the second half, and only Palace fans would begrudge them the equaliser scored in the 93rd minute. Alan Hart centred for Phil Summerall to stab the ball home and earn Millwall a cash bonus replay at Selhurst Park next Tuesday. I do remember the explosion of noise when Summerall scored that equaliser. It's one of the things, I can't remember much else about the game in truth, long while ago now. Like I say, I was 15 years old, but I do remember the kind of, it's almost like an overhead kick hooked into the net by Phil Summerall. Unfortunately, no video or TV footage exists from those far off times, dear listeners, but it was a great moment. It was in the one of my favourite ever seasons. I think maybe that's also hooked me in because it's 75-76 promotion winning season from Division 3. And we actually played Crystal Palace 3 times in 1 week. So we had this game on Saturday the 13th of December, 1 each, as I've said already, in front of 14,920 at the Den. Penalty missed, as they've noted here. We lost the replay, played on the Tuesday at Selhurst Park. That was a 2-1 loss in front of 18,000 there at Selhurst Park. John Moore in the 57th minute for Millwall, but Kemp and Taylor putting Palace 2-1, 2-0 ahead before we pulled it back to 2-1. But we'll go out of the FA Cup in the second round that season. So, as we said already, no trip to Scarborough. But then we would play Crystal Palace in the league. 7 days after the FA Cup game, we played Crystal Palace on the 20th of December, back at the Den. That was a 2-1 win for the Lions. And actually the spark that seemed to ignite a press from 12th position in Division 3 to eventually being promoted second to Division 2 that season. A wonderful, wonderful run. Goals there from Phil Summerhill, Phil Walker, and the Palace replied by Dave Swindlehurst. So, 3 games against Crystal Palace in 7 days. Very, very strange. This is a report here from there's the Sunday People. Last gasp Millwall, says John Barton. Hand it to Millwall. They do things with a style all their own. That remains true. Was it nearly 50 years ago? Wow. And that remains true to this day. Their cup hopes look stone cold dead, says John Barton, when in injury time they conjured a goal out the blue to force a replay. Mill had hardly a shot on target all afternoon to warm their numbed fans, including me. I don't remember it. Must have been cold. I can't remember that. They even missed a penalty. Then with Palace's defence apparently frozen, Summerhill latched onto Hart's header and slotted his shot just inside a post. A fitting end to a bizarre game in which there was often more entertainment off the pitch than on it. Near the end, hordes of young fans spilled over onto the field and held up the game for a while. Jago, Mill manager Gordon Jago, was delighted. He says, we've been out of form recently and we could have dropped when we missed that penalty, but we kept going and fully deserved the second chance. Wonderful cartoon right by the side. This is a different time. The 1970s is so familiar to me, dear listeners, and yet sometimes you look at things and think it was really remote in time. There's a cartoon of the caption is Sporting Fanny. I think she's meant to be like a female sports player. She's playing tennis, very short skirt, low cut décollage on her tennis dress. So Sporting Fanny saying, "I'm saving myself for the next round at my place tonight." That's the joke. You think, blimey, move on, Nick. So as I say, 1 each at the Den. We'd lose the replay at Selhurst Park. I didn't get along to that one, midweek game over at Crystal Palace. I was couldn't get over there for that one. But I've picked out 3 players from that team, that Millwall team. Nicky Chatterton obviously made his name at Crystal Palace, but would become a great Millwall servant. Born in West Norwood, 1954, Nicky Chatterton played Crystal Palace 1972, joining the Lions in 1978 for 100,000, and would go on to play 312 times for us, scoring 67 goals. I'm just going to... pen pictures are all from Neil's book, The A to Z of Millwall players. Nicky's transfer to the Den must have been one of the smartest moves by Millwall when they lured him from Crystal Palace, and will be seen as one of manager George Petch's best signings, along with Tony Towner and the late John Lyons. He helped the Lions to promotion from Division to Division 2 in 1985 after missing out on the Football League trophy win in 1983 through injury, before leaving to join the club to join Colchester United. That was in 1986. After an injury ended his career, he worked in Colchester's commercial department. He was a duty officer at a leisure centre, and later he became a window fitter and a builder in Eastbourne. Different era for footballers back then, listeners. And that theme will continue with the next player. I've picked out my namesake, no relation, Alan Hart, who I do remember him playing, and I don't remember this particular game or his contribution. I can remember Phil Summerhill's shot into the net and the explosion of joy that meant at least going back to school on the Monday morning wasn't quite such a bad thing as it was on the Wednesday after we got beat. But Alan Hart, born in Plumstead, played for us 1975-76, 23 appearances, 2 goals. Born in 1956, he played at Charlton, West Ham, Charlton again, then Millwall from July 75 before leaving to join Dulwich Hamlet, Gravesend and Northfleet till 1985. The pen picture here is Alan. It was a neat and tidy midfielder whose small stature wasn't ideal for the hurly-burly of third division football. He joined the Lions from Charlton. After initially finding himself behind Eddie Jones and Frank Saul, he found his feet and secured a first-team spot. But the arrival of John Seasman ended his Mill career, and after helping secure promotion, he left to sign for Dulwich Hamlet. It seems like a downward step, doesn't it? There we are. Alan is now living in Wickham Bishops, Essex, and is a director of independent window specialists West Lee. And he's also managed Heybridge Swifts under-16s side. Finally, Barry Salvage, a player that I do remember, the late Barry Salvage. I hadn't realised he'd passed away a few years ago, in actual fact. Barry Salvage had 2 spells. Again, I didn't know that until I checked Neil's book. He played for us 1968 to 69. I remember him from obviously 75 to 77, a winger, and he made a contribution in the famous game that is on YouTube where we beat Chelsea 3-0. He scored the first goal from memory. And I always found him quite an attractive, dangerous-looking winger. Missed a penalty in this one. Can't remember the missed penalty, but time erases bad memories, doesn't it, listeners? So he's listed as an outside left, 2 spells, 68 to 69, then 75 to 77. 75 games for Barry, 14 goals. Born in 1947, sadly passed away in Eastbourne. Born in Bristol, passed away in Eastbourne in 1986. Various clubs, Eastbourne, Horsham, Hastings, Fulham, Millwall, QPR, Brentford, spell in America, the St. Louis Stars. The pen picture goes on to say that Barry had a deceptively rangy, crouching style of movement. His last game for Fulham before joining Millwall was against the Lions, and the final game of his first spell at the Den was the return game at Craven Cottage. Gordon Jago snapped him up on a free transfer, and second time around he was a revelation, helping the club to claim a Division 3 promotion in 1976. And then, for me, one of the most exciting periods was that when we made it into Division 2 and we had some really terrific performances in the early part of the 76-77 season, which he was part of. Barry was a plumber by trade and a heating engineer, and then a taxi driver before suffering a fatal heart attack whilst on a charity run. This was in 1986, passed away in Eastbourne, as we said, at a charity event. Barry Salvage, great player. Do check out on YouTube if you're interested to see him. Really made a big contribution on the wing to this very successful season, played in this game that we've mentioned already versus Crystal Palace. There we are, dear listeners. That's my little preview. I hadn't realised we played Palace so many times in the FA Cup, 11 times. My fingers are crossed for a decent showing by Millwall. I hope you've enjoyed this little view back into the past. This is me, Nick Hart, signing off here. Do tune in after the weekend's coverage of that game at Selhurst Park. Do send me a voice note if you fancy it. It'd be great to hear from a wide range of people. You can contact me on X at achtungmillwall. You can actually send voice notes on there, but also if you hit me up, we can exchange mobile phone numbers and do it that way. Either way works. Really appreciate your tuning in and your listening support, dear listeners. Until the next edition of Achtung Millwall from me, Nick Hart, it's Arrivederci Millwall. Bye for now.
This podcast is part of the Sports Social Podcast Network.